On the evening of June 6, 1944, somewhere over the Normandy countryside south of the Orne estuary, a tow rope went slack. 34 of them went slack that night, released one after another from Halifax bombers out of RAF Tarrant Rushton in Dorset, each release leaving behind a large wooden aircraft descending in near silence toward landing zone N near Ranville. Each of those aircraft was carrying a tank. The approach speed was just under 100 miles an hour. The stall speed, with flaps fully deployed, was 52. There was no engine, no throttle, no option to go around if the approach went wrong. Whatever the pilots chose in the next 30 seconds was final. The cockpit sat 15 feet above the ground, on top of the fuselage, accessed by an internal wooden ladder, with a tandem arrangement for 2 pilots and a bulletproof windscreen that had been added late in the design process. Below them, in the rectangular cargo hold, measuring roughly 32 feet by 7 feet 10 inches, a Tetrarch light tank, crewed by soldiers from the 6th Airborne Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment, sat in darkness, in a vehicle that had been sealed shut since takeoff. The tank's engine had been running since before tow rope release, special exhaust ducts built into the fuselage venting fumes away from the crew. The tank crew couldn't see anything. They could feel the glider's angle steepen as the pilots dropped the large pneumatic flaps for a steep descent, the kind the War Office had specified in 1940 to minimize time over contested ground before touchdown. The impact was controlled, but hard. The Hamilcar's oleo-pneumatic shock absorbers, designed to be deflated after landing to lower the nose toward the ground, absorbed the first bounce. The pilots brought the aircraft to a stop, and one of them immediately slid down from the elevated cockpit to the cargo bay floor, walked to each undercarriage leg in sequence, and opened the valves to expel hydraulic fluid. The fuselage nose dropped. The tank driver pulled a lanyard to release his tie-down anchors, drove forward, and the cable attached to the front bulkhead triggered the swing door release. The entire nose of the aircraft opened on its hinges. A 7-ton Tetrarch light tank drove out of a wooden glider onto a field in France while the battle for Normandy was still being decided. If the nose jammed, which it did on that night and again 8 months later on the Rhine, the standing instruction was to drive through it. The tank's momentum was worth more than the airframe. That achievement is real, and it earned the attention it has received. The framing that has surrounded it for decades, that glider-delivered armour was unprecedented, bordering on the impossible, isn't accurate to the historical record. Glider-borne armoured vehicles weren't new in June 1944. Germany had built a glider capable of carrying armoured vehicles in 1941, flew it operationally that same year, built approximately 200 of them, and had withdrawn the type from service 6 months before the Hamilcar reached a Normandy landing zone. The comparison between these two aircraft deserves considerably more screen time than it usually receives. And, more importantly, it deserves to be done at the level of precision those two aircraft merit. Germany's trajectory toward the Gigant began small and proved something fundamental. On May 10, 1940, 10 DFS 230 assault gliders released their tow ropes over the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael in the opening hours of the Battle of France, and deposited 78 Fallschirmjäger engineers on the roof of a position that had been considered impregnable. The DFS 230 carried 10 equipped soldiers, roughly the interior volume of a delivery van, and had been designed by the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug, beginning in 1933, initially within the recreational gliding movement that the Treaty of Versailles had inadvertently created by restricting German military aviation while saying nothing about sailplanes. Fort Eben Emael fell within hours, seized by men who had arrived silently from above before any alarm could be raised. The Wehrmacht absorbed that lesson before the smoke cleared, and asked the next logical question. If 10 men could take a fortress, what could 200 do, carrying a tank? That question produced the Messerschmitt Me 321 Gigant. The design requirement, triggered by the Luftwaffe's planning for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, arrived at 2 manufacturers simultaneously. Germany's Transport Command had recognized that the Junkers Ju-52 trimotor, capable of carrying 18 soldiers or roughly 2 tons of cargo, was wholly inadequate for the scale of heavy equipment that an invasion of a defended island would require. The Technical Bureau issued a specification for a Großraum-Lastensegler, a large-capacity transport glider, capable of carrying an 88mm anti-aircraft gun complete with its towing tractor, or a medium tank, or up to 200 fully equipped soldiers. The codename was Project Warschau, Project Warsaw. 2 manufacturers received identical briefs simultaneously, Junkers and Messerschmitt. Both had 14 days to submit detailed design proposals. Both were instructed to begin ordering materials for an initial batch of 200 airframes before prototype results were available. Messerschmitt's team, working under engineer Josef Fröhlich at the company's facility in Leipheim in Bavaria, chose a framework of welded steel tubing supplied by the Mannesmann Company, covered with wooden spars and doped fabric. Junkers opted for all-wood construction, and the decision destroyed them. Their Ju-322 Mammoth proved structurally unstable in testing, and the entire design was cancelled. Messerschmitt secured the contract. By February 1941, roughly 14 weeks after the first materials order, the first complete Me 321 airframe stood ready at Leipheim. On February 25, 1941, Messerschmitt chief test pilot Karl Bauer climbed the ladder into the single-pilot cockpit positioned above the cargo bay, settled in behind the controls, and felt the Junkers Ju-90 towplane take the slack out of the cable. The Me 321 V1 was carrying 3 tons of ballast, not a full operational load, and it lifted off behind the 4-engine transport with controls that Bauer described as heavy throughout and sluggish to respond to input. The aircraft flew, the basic aerodynamics were sound, but the cockpit needed to be wider. A co-pilot would be essential on any operational mission, and the trailing edge flaps were too heavy for one pilot to operate without mechanical assistance. Engineers widened the cockpit for the production aircraft, fitted dual controls, added electric servo motors to move the flaps, and attached a braking parachute to reduce landing roll. The finished aircraft was extraordinary in scale. Wingspan 55 metres, 180 feet and 5 inches, roughly the width of a 6-lane motorway. Length 28 metres. The cargo hold ran 11 metres long, 3 metres wide and 3.5 metres high. It had been deliberately dimensioned to replicate the load space of a standard German railway flat car. Anything that could travel by rail could fit inside a Gigant. The cargo floor was reinforced with heavy steel cross-girders, stressed to carry distributed loads of up to 44,000 pounds, nearly twice the aircraft's own empty weight of around 26,000 pounds. With a removable auxiliary upper deck installed, the aircraft could carry 200 fully equipped troops. The rated payload was up to 20,000 kilograms by the most widely cited specifications, with some sources measuring the same capacity at 23 metric tons, depending on variant and measurement standard. The honest qualification is that 20,000 kilograms represented the design ceiling of the system, the figure the engineering was built around, rather than a load that was demonstrably carried on any specific documented mission. What matters is that the Gigant's hold was designed to the scale of a medium tank. The Luftwaffe's specification had demanded it could carry one, and the structure was rated accordingly. Getting this aircraft off the ground was a problem from the moment the first prototype flew. The Junkers Ju-90, used for Karl Bauer's initial test, had barely enough power to lift the empty glider with minimal ballast, and the situation with a full operational load would have been impossible. As an interim solution, Messerschmitt engineers devised what they called the Teukerschlepp, triple tow. 3 Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine heavy fighters, each producing around 2,200 horsepower combined, would attach to the Gigant by separate steel cables and take off together in a tight V formation, maintaining station on each other throughout the climb and cruise phase. The arrangement demanded a concrete runway of at least 3,950 feet to develop sufficient speed. The lead aircraft's cable ran 328 feet to the Gigant. The 2 flanking aircraft pulled on slightly shorter cables from either side. All 3 pilots had to unstick together, the 2 outer aircraft keeping precise position on the leader, while all 3 aircraft strained against a load that pulled back at them through steel cables with thousands of pounds of tension. The sequence in the air was worse. After leaving the runway, the Bf-110s were described by those who flew them as virtually hanging on their propellers throughout the initial climb at around 80 miles per hour. The strain on the cables increasing and releasing in violent jerks as turbulence moved the formation and the glider responded differently from its tug aircraft. Rate of climb, approximately 2.5 meters per second. Maximum tow speed, around 180 kilometers an hour. In any turbulence at all, the formation behaved unpredictably, and the tow pilots described the experience in terms that made clear they understood exactly how little margin for error existed in the arrangement. Rocket assistance was added to compensate. Walter HWK 109-500 hydrogen peroxide boosters, up to 6 per side, each producing 500 kilograms of thrust for 30 seconds, were mounted under the wings to give the formation enough energy to unstick on the takeoff run. The peroxide rockets were single-use, jettisoned after burnout, and demanded their own specialized equipment, servicing crews and storage facilities at every airfield the Gigant operated from. During an operational trial in 1941, a fully loaded Me-321 carrying 120 troops began its takeoff run with the rockets firing and the 3 Bf-110s pulling hard on their cables. The rockets under one wing fired correctly. The rockets under the opposite wing failed to ignite. Asymmetric thrust, full power on one side, dead weight on the other, veered the glider to starboard in the first seconds of the run. The 3 Bf-110s, connected by steel cables to an aircraft that was suddenly pulling sideways and accelerating through the asymmetry, couldn't compensate. They collided. The entire formation, 3 fighters and a loaded glider, crashed into a forest at the airfield boundary. 129 people were killed. It was, at that moment, the deadliest aviation accident in recorded history. The figure wouldn't be matched until the Tachikawa air disaster in Japan in 1953. A longer-term solution arrived in the form of the Heinkel HE-111Z Zwilling. Ernst Udet, the Luftwaffe's chief of procurement, approached Ernst Heinkel directly and asked for a purpose-built tug aircraft adequate for the Gigant. Heinkel's answer was to take two HE-111H6 medium bomber fuselages, join them with a new centre wing section incorporating a fifth Junkers Umo 211 inverted V12 engine, in addition to the four already present in the two airframes, and produce a five-engined aircraft with approximately 6,700 combined horsepower. 11 HE-111Z Zwilling aircraft, the Zwilling meaning twins, were eventually built. 11 aircraft for 200 gliders. The arithmetic of that ratio describes the operational limit of the entire programme more clearly than any other single figure. Approximately 200 Me-321 airframes were completed before production ended in early 1942. The Me-321A1 variant carried a single pilot, 100 built. The Me-321B1 had a crew of 3, pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and was armed with 2 to 4 7.92mm MG-15 machine guns, another 100 built. The first A1 production aircraft entered service in May 1941 with Großraumlastensegler 321 at Leipheim. By that autumn, the first operational Staffeln had deployed to Riga and were flying logistics missions to German positions in the Baltic, the islands of Muhu, Saaremaa and Hiiumaa. The cargo on those missions was fuel and oil in barrels, vehicles, general military stores. The aircraft that had been designed to land armour on British beaches was hauling petroleum for an army advancing east. By mid-1942, Me-321s were documented on the Eastern Front, in what a period Luftwaffe photograph, with its original German caption, calls them directly: Lastensegler, cargo gliders, photographed in Russia in 1942 and 1943. Alongside a Junkers Ju-90 tow plane. In late 1942, a detachment of Me-321s assembled with HE-111Z tugs and moved toward the Eastern Front in preparation for supply runs to the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad. By the time the formation could position itself at the nearest usable airfield, the Red Army had captured every German-held airstrip inside the Stalingrad pocket. There was nowhere to land. The Gigants transferred to the Crimea, resupplying forces in the Kuban region. They were recalled to Germany in spring 1943. Formal disbandment came in December 1943. The aircraft that replaced the Me-321's strategic function was a different machine. The Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant, the same fuselage, 6 Gnome-Rhone 14N radial engines producing around 6,800 combined horsepower, a revised 8-wheeled undercarriage, was a powered transport aircraft. The Me-321 was a glider. Both carried the name Gigant. They shared an airframe and nothing else of operational significance. Conflating them is the single most common error in casual treatments of this period, and it matters because the Me-323's story includes one of the most decisive demonstrations of what happened to any large, slow aircraft when it encountered fighter opposition in contested airspace. On April 22, 1943, 27 Me-323s of Transportgeschwader 5, loaded with aviation fuel for the Afrika Korps, southbound across the Mediterranean near Sicily, were intercepted by 7 squadrons of Spitfires and P-40s. Only 6 survived. The powered Gigant, with 6 engines and defensive gun positions, had no answer for a coordinated fighter interception. The unpowered Me-321 would have been still less capable of offering one. The Hamilcar's development began at almost exactly the same moment in calendar time and on completely parallel institutional lines, driven by a different nation asking the same initial question and arriving at a radically different answer about what the aircraft was for. In June 1940, Churchill's directive ordering the formation of British airborne forces set off a cascade of specifications. By early 1941, the War Office had established 4 separate military glider requirements. 3, the Hotspur, the Hengist and the Horsa, were infantry transports. The 4th was different in kind. Air Ministry Specification X.27/40 called for a glider capable of transporting heavy equipment in support of airborne troops, with heavy explicitly expanded by 1941 to include artillery and armoured vehicles. The language of the specification described what Britain needed: not a way to move supplies to an established front, but a way to deliver firepower to a landing zone where there was no established front yet. General Aircraft Limited was selected in January 1941. The company had been working on tank-carrying glider concepts already, including one early proposal in which the tank's driver would simultaneously fly the aircraft from within the turret through a series of internal control modifications, with the turret protruding outside the fuselage so the gun could engage targets as the glider descended. GAL and the War Office examined this together in January 1941 and agreed it was unworkable. A conventional configuration was settled on: high-wing monoplane, all-wood construction, crew of 2 in a tandem cockpit on top of the fuselage, accessed by internal ladder, with the entire nose section designed to open sideways on hinges. The name followed British convention for military gliders: historical figures whose names begin with H. The choice was Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general and father of Hannibal, commander of Carthaginian forces in the Iberian Peninsula during the First Punic War, arguably the most capable Carthaginian commander of his generation. The name is pronounced as British classical scholarship renders it: Hamilcar, stress on the second syllable, which is also how it appears as the primary entry in Collins' English Dictionary. This is a detail that the audience for this particular comparison has noticed, and noticed loudly, when presenters have got it wrong. Before committing to a full-scale prototype, General Aircraft built a half-scale model, the GAL.50, which flew once in September 1941. Towed by an Armstrong-Whitworth Whitley. The single test flight ended badly when the test pilot approached the landing area too low, raised the flaps seeking extra glide instead of lowering them for drag, and stalled the aircraft into the ground. The prototype was wrecked. The trial was nonetheless declared successful enough to proceed. The lesson about the Hamilcar's aerodynamics under flap was absorbed into training before any operational pilot flew the full-scale version. The full-scale prototype, serial DP206, was completed at GAL's facility at Hanworth in Middlesex in early 1942 and transported by road to RAF Snaith in Yorkshire, because Hanworth's airfield runway was too short for the aircraft to get airborne. On March 27, 1942, 13 months and 1 day after Karl Bauer's first flight in the ME-321, the Hamilcar lifted off behind a Handley Page Halifax bomber. The test pilots reported handling characteristics that were workable. There were few significant differences between the prototypes and the production aircraft, which was unusual for a design of this complexity, and suggests that GAL had understood the aerodynamics correctly from the beginning. What GAL had not understood correctly was production management. The completed aircraft was the longest wooden aircraft built during the war, 68 feet from nose to tail, wingspan of 110 feet, height of 20 feet and 3 inches with the tail down, empty weight 18,400 pounds, maximum takeoff weight 36,000 pounds, payload 17,600 pounds, 8,000 kilograms. The cargo hold measured approximately 32 feet long by 7 feet 10 inches wide, with a height between 6 and 7.5 feet, depending on position within the bay. Both the Tetrarch Mark VII and the American M22 Locust light tank fit inside, with clearances so tight that their crews had no choice but to remain in the vehicle for the entire flight, sealed in the dark interior of an armoured vehicle inside a wooden aircraft, unable to see the ground approaching, feeling the buffet and shudder of the tow rope connection and the glider's response to thermals and altitude changes. The wings were set high above the fuselage, above the cargo bay rather than through it, specifically so that their attachment points didn't intrude on the usable interior volume. The aircraft's approach angle was designed for steepness. The ratio of wingspan to length matched that of an Avro Lancaster rather than a conventional glider, a deliberate choice by the War Office in 1940 to ensure the aircraft would release low, descend steeply, and spend the minimum possible time in the landing zone's airspace during an approach under fire. One compressed air bottle operated the pneumatic flap system, sized for exactly one landing, small enough to save weight and reduce the risk of the bottle being hit by enemy fire and exploding. One bottle, one approach, one chance. Vehicle unloading was engineered to be fast. For tanks, the driver pulled a lanyard, releasing the hold-down anchors, drove forward, and the forward motion pulled a cable that operated the swing door release, the nose opening without any action required from the pilots. For universal carriers and other non-tank vehicles, one pilot had to slide down the fuselage from the elevated cockpit, drop to the ground, walk to each undercarriage leg and manually release the valves to deflate the oleo-pneumatic shock absorbers, lowering the nose gradually toward the ground. Then climb back inside and operate the door release line. In emergencies, tanks could drive directly through an unopened nose. This happened in both Normandy and at the Rhine. The fuselage didn't survive intact, but the tank and its crew did. An early design feature, removed before full production, called for an under-fuselage hatch through which a Bren light machine gun could be fired in the prone position during the approach to the landing zone. The hatch was dropped for practical reasons: weight, the difficulty of aiming prone through a narrow aperture at low altitude, the limited effect on what would typically be ground fire from below. Its presence in the original specification is evidence of the environment the designers assumed the aircraft would routinely be entering. Production of the Hamilcar was a sustained institutional failure. Between March and September 1942, GAL promised 18 aircraft and delivered 1. The Ministry of Aircraft Production dispatched an industrial panel of 3 senior experts to GAL's facilities in September 1942, whose report identified poor management, inadequate organisation, conflicts between GAL's senior staff and the Hamilcar production group the ministry had formed to assist them, and a piecemeal ordering system that disrupted material flow. Several managers were replaced. Production improved, but never to the rates the War Office had demanded. Requirements fluctuated between 360 and 800 aircraft, neither figure being achievable. The USAAF placed a separate order for 140 Hamilcars in late 1943, intending to use them to airlift construction equipment to Pacific airfields, and cancelled the entire order in February 1944 when production remained too slow to meet the June 1944 deadline. By January 1944, 27 Hamilcars had been assembled and were ready for use. By June 1944, that number had reached approximately 80. 344 were built in total before production ended in 1946. Training for Hamilcar pilots took place primarily at RAF Tarrant Rushton in Dorset, which had been designated the Hamilcar operational base in November 1943. The Heavy Glider Conversion Unit at RAF Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire, roughly 15 miles west of Oxford, Bryce rhyming with prize in the pronunciation used at the station and by the surrounding area, served as the broader conversion training centre for the British glider force. Both pilots and air landing infantry trained at Bryce Norton. Photographs from around 1942 show British glider infantry training inside airspeed Horsa gliders on the ground there. C Squadron of the Glider Pilot Regiment, which specialised in Hamilcar operations, completed over 2,800 training lifts, with an average of 50 lifts per crew. 7 pilots were killed in those 2,800 lifts. That number needs context to mean anything, and the context arrives shortly. Place the two aircraft's specifications beside each other, and the numbers are unambiguous in one direction. The Gigant, 55 metres of wingspan against the Hamilcar's 33.5. Payload rated at 20,000 kilograms against the Hamilcar's 8,000, more than twice as large by the design ceiling figures. Cargo hold volume several times greater. 200 built and operationally withdrawn before the Hamilcar had fired a shot. Germany built the larger aircraft, flew it first by over 13 months, and had removed it from inventory while Britain was still manufacturing Hamilcars in 1943. By any measure of raw scale, that comparison isn't close. The scale comparison is also, on its own, the wrong lens for the question these two aircraft actually represent. The Me-321 was designed with assault credentials. Its original specification in 1940 called for delivering armour and heavy weapons onto a defended beach in the context of an invasion. Germany had both the requirement and the engineering answer. The aircraft that would have landed tanks on British shores existed, flew, and was real. Then Sea Lion was cancelled, and the aircraft that had been designed to deliver armour onto British beaches went to the Eastern Front to haul fuel in barrels. The Luftwaffe's own organisational language describes what happened next. The units responsible for Me-321 towing operations were called Schleppgruppen für Lastensegler, towing groups for cargo gliders. Contemporary Luftwaffe photographs from the Eastern Front, bearing their original period captions, label the aircraft as Lastensegler, not Sturmsegler, assault gliders, but Lastensegler, cargo gliders. These weren't retrospective characterizations. They were the Luftwaffe's real-time description of its own aircraft in its own institutional language. The tactical classification matched the operational reality. Every documented Eastern Front Me-321 mission was a supply run to an airfield already under German control. The operational limitations that produced this outcome were structural, not accidental. The Troika Schlepp arrangement's operational radius was barely 400 kilometres on a single fuel load, too short for operations deep enough behind Soviet lines to reach a defended or contested landing zone. The Ichi-111Z increased range, but was available in numbers too small to equip the requirement. A glider, once it has landed in genuinely hostile territory, can't take off again, which means any assault mission in contested airspace is a one-way commitment that ends with the aircraft and its cargo in enemy hands if the assault fails. The Gigant's size and its requirement for specialized ground handling equipment made recovery from a failed assault essentially impossible to plan for. The aircraft was conceived for an assault that never happened, and then used for the logistics role its circumstances permitted. The Hamilcar's operational record does not have this complexity. From its first combat deployment to its last, in every documented instance, the Hamilcar was employed in the assault phase of an airborne operation. On June 6, 1944, 34 Hamilcars were in the opening wave of the Normandy airborne assault. They had departed RAF Tarrant Rushton, carrying Tetrarch tanks from the 6th Airborne Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment, 17-pounder anti-tank guns from the 3rd and 4th Air Landing Anti-Tank Batteries, and universal carriers. They landed at Zone N near Ranville, while the fight for the Orne bridges was still live. 20 Tetrarch tanks landed that night, marking the first time armoured vehicles had ever been delivered directly into combat from the air, not as a follow-on lift after a beachhead was established. In the first wave, while the battle was open. In September 1944, 38 Hamilcars in 3 planned lifts carried 17-pounders, universal carriers and stores into the opening phase of the airborne assault at Arnhem and Nijmegen. In March 1945, 48 Hamilcars, 8 of them carrying M22 Locust tanks, landed east of the Rhine as part of the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Every time, assault phase, no rear area resupply, no logistics consolidation, no delivery to an established position. Germany built an aircraft capable, by its engineering, of delivering heavy loads into combat. Britain built an aircraft that was used, consistently and exclusively, for that purpose. These are answers to different questions. Germany's question was, how much weight can a glider carry? Britain's question was, how do we put armour and anti-tank guns into the first 60 seconds of a battle that the enemy doesn't yet know has started? The Gigant answered the first question. The Hamilcar answered the second. Every documentary treatment of British glider operations reaches the same moment of audience curiosity, and it has nothing to do with payload comparisons. The question that generates more replies in comment sections than any technical specification, more than wingspan, more than towing arrangements, more than production numbers, is this: what did the glider pilots do after they landed? There are 3 answers, and all 3 are documented. The first is that British glider pilots fought as infantry, not because circumstances forced it on some occasions, but because it was the standing doctrine of the glider pilot regiment from the regiment's founding. Lieutenant Colonel George Chatterton, who commanded the regiment's 1st Battalion, established the position that trained soldiers sitting idle behind a wrecked airframe while a battle raged around them was an unacceptable waste. Standing orders upon landing specified a sequence: unload passengers or cargo, move on foot to a pre-designated rendezvous point, form up with other glider pilots arriving from nearby aircraft into an ad hoc infantry platoon, and report to assigned defensive positions. Post-landing duties included perimeter defence, anti-tank positions when 17-pounders had been delivered into the zone, reconnaissance patrols into ground no one else had mapped, ammunition runs under fire, and casualty evacuation under fire. No one below the rank of sergeant was accepted into the glider pilot regiment. Officers and warrant officers formed a substantial proportion. Training combined elementary flying at RAF schools with an infantry curriculum that made these men functional ground soldiers. The regiment was unique in this. American CG-4A Waco pilots had no equivalent regimental doctrine. American practice was for glider pilots to return to friendly lines once their aircraft was down. And in the confusion of actual operations, this often meant individual improvisation rather than any organised ground action. British pilots formed up. They carried their weapons, they knew how to use crew-served weapons, and they were expected to do so. The scale of what this doctrine meant in practice is visible in the regiment's casualty records. Over the entire war, 550 members of the Glider Pilot Regiment were killed. Norway, November 1942. 2. In the disastrous Operation Freshman raid on the Telemark heavy water plant, where the tug aircraft flew into a mountain and all aboard were killed, and the second glider's tow rope snapped and the aircraft crashed with its passengers captured and later executed. Sicily, July 1943. 57. Many of them not from the landing at all, but from the water. American tug pilots, when anti-aircraft fire began over the approach routes, released their tow lines over the Mediterranean. Gliders ditched at sea with fully equipped troops aboard who couldn't swim in 60 pounds of kit and ammunition. The aftermath at the airfield was incendiary. British glider troops went hunting for the American tug crews. Pilots on both sides were placed under arrest until tempers cooled. The bond that formed between the two air forces afterward was forged in that anger. Normandy, June 1944. 34 regiment members killed. Arnhem, September 1944. 230. The Rhine Crossing, March 1945. 100. Other operations across the war, 126. 230 at Arnhem. The 1st Airborne Division landed 10,000 men at Arnhem and Oosterbeek and fought for 9 days in a shrinking perimeter, while 30 Corps' Armoured Relief Column fell behind schedule south of Nijmegen. The division suffered nearly 8,000 casualties, killed, wounded or captured. Around 2,300 withdrew across the Rhine. Throughout those 9 days, glider pilots fought as integrated members of the defence. Not auxiliaries, not support personnel, but infantrymen holding the line alongside paratroopers and air-landing rifle battalions. Staff Sergeant Harold Norman Andrews of No. 11 Flight, E Squadron, No. 2 Wing of the Glider Pilot Regiment, flew in all 4 of the regiment's major operations: Sicily, Normandy, Arnhem and the Rhine Crossing. One of only 6 glider pilots known to have completed all 4. His awards included the Distinguished Flying Medal and Bar. His account of D-Day, in which he flew Horsa 262 from Down Ampney, carrying 2 medical jeeps, a trailer, a motorcycle, and Brigadier Hill's personal kit, describes the final approach over Normandy in terms that leave no ambiguity about what landing in a contested zone actually looked like from the cockpit. The smoke from an RAF bombing raid over the coast blotted out landmarks as they crossed the French coast. His co-pilot, Sergeant Senier, was on the controls, while Andrews searched for visual reference points. Flak rose from the ground below at a pace Andrews described as appearing lazy from altitude until the tracer burned out. They found their reference landmarks, 2 specific houses on the approach, crossed the coast, counted off 90 seconds, and released the tow rope. Speed dropped to 80 miles per hour. Something that may have been an anti-tank gun fired twice with a flat trajectory in the dark to their left as they descended toward the field. They landed. A bump, then another, then a wheel catching briefly and trying to swing the glider, Andrews holding full opposite rudder, until they stopped. He jumped from the cockpit, collected his rifle, and spent the next several hours moving on foot through enemy territory in the dark. A grenade exchange with a German sentry at a crossroads at short range. Then a slow withdrawal back to the dawn rendezvous point, where 30 glider pilots gathered at a farmhouse and began organizing patrols to cover the perimeter. By 9 o'clock that evening, Andrews and the other pilots at the rendezvous were in their slit trenches, watching the main evening lift arrive. Gliders covering the landing zone in numbers that silenced even the German ground fire temporarily. He noted from the high ground, looking back toward his own landing position, that what he had taken for a binding break during his touchdown had actually been the wing of another glider clipped on the rollout. He had landed that close to another aircraft in the dark at 80 miles per hour on a field he'd never seen. The second part of the post-landing question, how pilots actually returned to England, had less formal architecture than might be expected. Pilots did return. Regimental accounts describe returning pilots being confined to barracks on arrival back in England. References to evacuation plans coordinated with the timing of the main evening lift, and pilots being moved in organised groups back toward airheads and embarkation. At Arnhem, evacuation wasn't available to most pilots inside the Oosterbeek perimeter. For the majority, extraction depended on the same improvised routes as everyone else. A river crossing in the dark on a rope, or not crossing at all. The formal mechanics of how a pilot moved from a Normandy field back to an English airbase was situational and undocumented as a systematic procedure. What is documented is that the regiment prepared pilots to function without that evacuation for as long as the ground situation demanded. The third answer is the simplest. They were armed, continuously, because that was the regiment's standard. Personal weapons were a constant. Training in crew-served weapons, the regiment's curriculum covered light and medium support weapons alongside flying, meant these weren't men who had simply been handed a rifle and told to point it at something. By the Rhine crossing in March 1945, the regiment had been reinforced by RAF pilots who had volunteered for glider duties and been converted in concentrated programs. These pilots, with limited time to absorb both the flying and the ground doctrine, nonetheless arrived at the Rhine operation with the expectation that landing the aircraft was the beginning of their work, not the end of it. Casualty rates at the Rhine crossing for the glider pilots approached 30% in that single operation. 90% of the 344 gliders in the British component landed within 200 metres of their targets, and one glider, assigned to take a railway station, landed on the tracks inside the station building. The objective was reached before the aircraft stopped moving. Training paid its own cost before any of those operations were planned. The Glider Pilot Regiment has been described by veterans and by historians of the British Airborne programme as carrying the highest death rate in training of any unit in the British Armed Forces across the war. Isolating glider pilot training fatalities from the broader RAF training death total is difficult in the available records. But the direction is supported by what is known about military aviation training across the war as a whole. British RAF training programs killed more than 8,000 personnel across all aircrew categories during the war: fighters, bombers, transport crews, glider pilots, in accidents that had nothing to do with enemy action. This was training in peacetime equivalent conditions on home airfields. The pressure to accelerate cohorts through programs to fill operational vacancies was sustained throughout the war and produced training conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Glider training carried specific hazards that powered aviation training didn't share. A tow rope failure in a powered aircraft leaves the pilot with an engine and options. A tow rope failure in a glider leaves the pilot with whatever altitude exists at that moment and the ground available within gliding range. Night navigation in formation behind a tug, maintaining position in the dark through turbulence, was a skill that only practice could build, and that the early months of training frequently revealed through accidents. Landing on rough terrain, on fields not surveyed in advance, in aircraft without brakes, with a full load inside. All of these were training conditions that the operational scenario demanded, but that no simulator could adequately replicate. The Troika Schlepp accident that killed 129 people in 1941 wasn't a combat mission. It was an operational trial, the zone between training and operations that glider programs inhabited continuously, because the only way to practice the actual task was to do the actual task. The ME-321 program's towing arrangement was inherently dangerous enough that the accident rate across training exercises was predictable in aggregate, if not in the specifics of when and where. For Hamilcar-specific training, the numbers were considerably lower. 7 killed in over 2,800 lifts. The relative safety reflects both the simpler dynamics of a single 4-engine Halifax tow and the deliberate policy of limiting tank crew participation to 1 or 2 training flights, landing on carefully marked airfields rather than open countryside, to avoid losing both aircraft and irreplaceable specialized personnel in training accidents. Audience members who have shared personal testimony about training fatalities, including accounts of specific courses where more than a third of the pilots in a class didn't survive to reach an operational unit, are describing something that can't be confirmed as a program-wide statistic, but that accurately reflects the extreme variation between cohorts, periods, aircraft types, and stations. Some training programs were dramatically more lethal than others, and the aggregate figure for the war conceals the concentrated experience of specific groups in specific conditions. The direction of those accounts is consistent with the documented scale of RAF training casualties across the war. The specific percentages for any given class or period aren't recoverable from publicly available records. What the regimental roll provides is 550 names. The majority of those men died after landing safely. Germany built the bigger glider, built it earlier, and built more of them. The specifications aren't close and weren't close at the time. The Gigant's wingspan was 66% larger. Its rated payload was more than double. Its cargo volume was several times greater. 200 were operational before the Hamilcar had left the prototype phase. The operational record tells a different story from the specifications. The Me-321, whatever its original design intent, was classified by the Luftwaffe as a cargo glider used for logistics on the Eastern Front and never documented over a defended or contested landing zone. The Me-323, its powered successor, was destroyed at a rate of 21 aircraft lost in a single interception near Sicily when it attempted contested airspace. The Hamilcar was used in the assault phase of every operation it flew, carried armour and anti-tank weapons into the opening minutes of 3 separate contested battles across 3 years of war, and was never employed for rear area logistics in any documented instance. Both nations solved the engineering problem of lifting impossible weight off the ground in a glider and delivering it somewhere else. Only one of those nations solved the operational problem of landing that weight in the first seconds of a battle that was still being decided, consistently, by design, from the first day they flew it. The 550 members of the Glider Pilot Regiment who were killed in that war knew what they had signed up to do. They picked up their rifles when the aircraft stopped moving. They held the line at Arnhem for 9 days. They drove gliders into railway station buildings and onto the exact squares of ground they'd been assigned because precision was the point, and there was no second chance once the tow rope was cut. That's the difference between answering the question of how much a glider can carry and answering the question of what you do with the weight once you've landed in the dark behind enemy lines. The Gigant answered the first. The Hamilcar answered the second, every time, with the same soldiers who had just flown it. If this comparison is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. There's more where this came from.